And so last week, I gave you a message, don't make a scene, and we saw that woman that came in. And we saw that kind of awkward scene between that woman and her faithful Savior, didn't we? We saw the spectacle she made of herself as she crashed that party. Really, and I was thinking back, oh, that was a good title for that message, Crash the Party. Because as we're going to see this week, we're going to see Crash the Ceiling. And this is one of the things as we go forward, this is what I want to be stuck in your mind as we go forward in the church, and what we are to do and the lengths that we are to go is to crash the ceiling. Because as we're going to see in our passage this morning, that what part of what God has called us to do, what He has called us to do and what He's called us to be is to be, first, to be bold. Secondly, to take risk. And 3, to maybe do some things in some unconventional ways. We're going to crash the ceiling. And here's the question that I want us to answer, and this is the question that I want you to answer as we go through this message. And maybe you've never thought about this question, maybe it's never even entered your mind. But here's the question I want you to answer, and then I want us to answer as a church. It's how far are you willing to go to get one person to Jesus? Have you ever thought about that? Like, how much are you willing to give up to see one person come to Christ? How far am I willing to go? What am I willing to sacrifice? What am I willing to give up in return for one soul? I don't want us to just sit there and put it in these figurative terms and say, like I was talking to my boys, and I told Titus the other day, I said, Titus, I love you to the moon and back. He had to one up me, and he said, I love you to Saturn and back. So I came back to him yesterday, and I said, Titus, I love you to Saturn and back. And he goes, oh yeah? He says, well, I love you all the way to heaven where God's at and back. I'm like, well, you can't top that one. I also want us to use those figurative terms to say, I do whatever. Really think about that. What would you give up? What would you be willing to give up? What would you be willing to sacrifice to bring one friend to Jesus? Like I kind of did with you last week, in Luke chapter 5, I want you to kind of place yourself in this story. Like how I asked you to, identify whether you would be the woman in the story, whether you be Simon the Pharisee. In this story, I want you to place yourself in the story, and I want you to ask yourself the question, who am I more like? That's kind of one of the tests of a great story, is that when you hear a story, it immediately brings you in, and you start to think to yourself, okay, what would it have been like to be there? What would I have done? How would I have reacted in that situation? And then another test of a great story is where you can identify with a person in the story. That's what draws you in. What makes you emotionally attached to the story or to the movie is when can I personally identify with somebody in the story. And so that's what I want you to do as we look at this passage this morning. Who am I in this narrative? And I want to share with you just a little bit of the setting of Luke chapter 5. It's in a small town called Capernaum. And Capernaum was this small kind of country town. It wasn't very large, but it is where Peter grew up. And some of the scholars have made pretty good cases that the house that Jesus is preaching in here in Luke chapter 5 is actually Peter's house. We don't know that for sure, but it could be, okay? So I want you to kind of picture this scene in your mind, this little country town, and they got pickup trucks in the driveway. They're all pickup four-wheel drive trucks. But there's also some guests that are in the house. These people, they're not locals. They're coming from out of town, and they are some of the bigwigs. They are the religious leaders. And so they're not coming to hear Jesus, to hear anything, to learn anything, but they're coming to be skeptic. Because what has Jesus just done right before Luke chapter 5? Well, he's healed a leper. He's healed a leper. And so that news spreads out. And so all these religious leaders, these Pharisees and these scribes, they all come to hear Jesus because, what? They want to see another healing. Why? They want to see if this maybe truly is the Messiah. No, they're coming because they want to find a way to discredit this one who calls himself the Messiah. And so they were there to investigate. And they've all gathered in the house. It's all crowded in the house in this small town. And that's where we pick up in Luke chapter 5, verse 17. Luke says, one day he was teaching, and there were some Pharisees and teachers of the law sitting there, who had come from every village of Galilee and Judea and from Jerusalem. And the power of the Lord was present for him to perform healing. And some men were carrying on a bed a man who was paralyzed. And they were trying to bring him in and to set him down in front of him. Now, I don't know, you probably heard the story, maybe you have, but there's a sense in which you read it and you hear it and you think like, oh, well, yeah, that's what I would have done. No, you wouldn't have. Like, what these four men do here in this story, it's insane. It's unconventional. They go up to the roof and they tear a hole in possibly Peter's roof, okay? And so you think about it, what would it have been like to be there? You think about it, there's this packed house, there's these religious leaders, and not surprisingly, they're all sitting up at the front. But for the most part, in this house, it's standing room only. People are standing in the back, they're spilling out the doors. Everyone, they're sitting in the windowsills, and everyone is leaning in, trying to hear what Jesus is going to say. And then in verse 18, it tells us that some men carrying a paralyzed friend on a mat, they were trying to get him to Jesus. Now, Mark tells us, the Gospel of Mark tells us, he gives us the detail that there were four men who were carrying this man. Now, we don't know a lot about them, but we do know that being a paralytic in that day was often a death case. It was a time, when you think about it, there were no wheelchairs, there was no government assistance. And so you pretty much depended on, hopefully you had some very, 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 very nice people around you that you could depend on for literally everything in your life. But if you didn't have any people close to you who would take care of you like that, then you pretty much didn't have a chance. And so you got these four friends who seemed to be that for this man. And I don't know what caused them to take their friend to Jesus. Maybe they heard about Jesus healing the leper, and maybe their minds automatically thought to their friend who is paralyzed sitting on the mat. And so they run to go get their friend to take him to Jesus, because if Jesus could do that for a leper, then he could probably do that for our friend. But you think about it, I don't know how the man who was paralyzed would have felt about this little field trip. Because apparently these guys are not from, they're not from Capernaum. So they must have traveled from a neighboring village or a neighboring town, because we see that they tried to get into the house, but nobody recognizes them and nobody will move out of the way from them. But you think about this man who's being carried on this mat. I doubt he was, at least initially, very excited about going. Because, he's tried some things. He's gone to see other people. He's tried all these different these possibilities that maybe be able to improve his condition. But then he hears about this man, Jesus, and he says, you know what? I might as well try. I might as well try because my condition isn't going to get any better. And so he's got these four, I'm going to call them buddies. These four buddies decide to pick him up, put him on a stretcher, and carry him to Jesus. But as they get to the house, everybody's standing in the door. They try to make their way, and I love how the King James says it. It says they sought means. They tried to find a way to get this man into the house, to get him to Jesus, but nobody will budge. Nobody will budge. Everybody is comfortable. Everybody is secure. They don't want to give up their spot. And so it says they sought means. And so I just try to put myself in this situation and think, watching these four guys as they're trying to find a way to get their friend to Jesus, and then just one of them comes up and says, you know what, let's carry him up on the roof. Let's do that. That's a good idea. Well, what are we going to do when we get up? Well, we'll just tear a hole in the roof. If we can't go through the doors, and if we can't go through the windows, then we'll just tear a hole in the roof. And this is where I start to think that maybe what we're dealing with here in Luke chapter 5 are some OU fans. Because it seems like something like an OU fan would do, because there's this kind of this redneck reasoning that's going on with this story at this point, isn't there? Like, we're just going to do it. We're just going to tear a hole in the roof. We don't care. And so they go up on the roof, and this is part of the story where I just naturally think of myself in the story. And I like to place myself in this scene, and But as you place yourself in the story, nobody ever, you're not going to place yourself as one of the Pharisees or one of the religious leaders. Like when you place yourself in the story, you're the hero, right? You're the one that did the right thing. But how would you have reacted? What would you have done? See, these good old boys, they're just doing whatever it takes to get their friend to Jesus. They didn't have a spiritual pedigree. They didn't follow the rules of etiquette. But one thing was a matter of priority to them. And it was that they got their friend to Jesus. And they were going to do whatever it took to get their friend off the mat. But verse 19 says something as they try to get their friend to Jesus. Verse 19 says, but not finding any way to bring him in. Why? Because of the crowd. Because of the crowd. And so here's the question I want us to kind of wrestle with as a church. Is what do you do? What do you do when you can't find a way? What do you do when you know you've been given a sacred assignment? You know that God has been speaking to your heart. He's called you to go speak to this person, to this loved one, to this friend, to this neighbor. But it just seems like there's no way. What do you do when you go and the windows are shut and the door doesn't open? What do you do when there doesn't seem to be a way? What do you do when you speak to your friend, to your loved one, and they shut you down? They say, no, I'm not interested in that. What do you do when you invite your loved one to church and they tell you, maybe when things get less busy? What do you do then? Well, you could go back home and you could justify it. You say, well, I tried. At least I tried. But then every time you see your friend lying on the mat, you'll wonder if maybe you could have tried a little bit harder. You could put it off until later, right? What do you do when you go into that situation and God starts pulling on your heart to make a move, to do something, but then you say, oh, no, this is not a good time. This is, I'll wait until a better time. It's the holidays. I didn't want to ruin the Christmas dinner. I don't want to make things awkward. But your friend is still on the mat. He's still paralyzed. And as you do that, as you try to justify, you continue to say within yourself, you just hope that maybe there'll just be another opportunity down the road. What do these four friends do? You say, here's the plan. And you think about it, doesn't seem to be a very well thought out plan. And it would be very easy for people to say in this situation, well, that's a little too impractical. Do you think that's really the best way? Don't you think this is going to be too distracting for the other people in the house? And don't you think it's going to be kind of embarrassing? For the rest of our lives, do we really want to be known as the people who crashed the ceiling, who made a hole in this roof? And you think about how expensive this is going to be. We're going to have to pay for that roof. And what if it doesn't work out? What if Jesus gets angry with this? Is Jesus the kind of person who's willing to interrupt all of this for one person? Is he willing to do, are we really going to interrupt what 100 people are doing for one person? So what do you do when you can't find a way? You crash the ceiling. You crash the ceiling. And I'm saying this is what I want us to be committed as a church. That we're going to do whatever it takes to get one person to Jesus. We're going to do whatever it takes. And you know what? It might be expensive. And it might be impractical. And it might make some people in the house uncomfortable. And it might be risky. And it might not be the way that we've done it. But we're going to crash the ceiling. Because you see, crashing the ceiling, it means that we're going to have this bias towards action, that we're going to see the urgency of the mission. We're going to see the urgency of the calling and understand that we don't have any time to waste. Why do you think these guys crashed the roof? There was an urgency in their mission. I mean, because if it could have waited, if it could have waited until the Bible study was over, don't you think they would have waited? There was a reason why they crashed the roof. There was a reason why they broke through the ceiling, is because they understood that there was an urgency about it. Maybe the friend, maybe he was close to dying. Maybe he was close to giving up. Maybe the friend was so depressed that he had tried to commit suicide. And they knew that if they didn't get it done now, it could be eternally too late. You see, crashing the ceiling means that you're going to take some risk. And you're going to put yourself out there. And you're going to do some things that other people are going to look at you and say, that's not the way I would have done it. I mean, all the ways you could have done it. Like one missionary said, he said, I had a man who criticized the way that I evangelized. And he said, well, I like the way that I do it better than the way that you don't do it. You see, crashing the ceiling means that, you know what, you're going to take some ridicule and some criticism. But you see, when you see the urgency of the mission and you understand there's no time to waste, and you have this boldness and you have this, you know what, sometimes you just need this I don't care attitude. You really do. Just like we saw last week with the woman who came and worshiped Jesus, you think she had a little bit of I don't care attitude? Like, I don't care what everybody else in the house thinks. This is me and Jesus. And I'm going to worship him. I'm going to pour out my love. And I don't care what anybody else thinks. These four friends, you could bet they had an I don't care attitude. Because I'm going to tear a hole in this roof. I'll burn the whole place down if it means that I have to get my friend to Jesus. That's what I'm saying I want us to be as a church. And I love this story of friends who are so committed to someone who is in need that they'll do whatever it takes to make sure that the person is taken care of. When you hear this story, who do you want to be in the story? Do you want to be the crowd, or do you want to be one of the friends? Hopefully everybody in here in their right mind says, I want to be one of the friends. I want to be one of the friends. But you think about it. I think sometimes, me, myself, I want to be a friend. I want to be the person who is carrying somebody on a stretcher, and I'm not sitting inside the service being a sermon critic. But I can identify with the crowd here a little bit. Because you think about it, they're all in the house, they're facing the teacher, and their backs are turned to what? To the need outside the door. They're in there, they're taking notes, and they're writing down all the scriptures, and they're writing down his major points, and Jesus, he preached with 3 points too, just like all preachers. And then they're writing them all down, and they are just totally oblivious to what is going on outside the house. When someone tries outside the house, tries to get in the house, they're not really concerned. They're not concerned about the people on the outside getting on the inside because of their experience in the house. Because, listen, when the description of the crowd is that your experience inside the house is more important than the salvation of those outside the house. And I want y'all to get that. That when your experience inside this house is more important than the salvation of souls outside of this house, Houston, we got a problem. There's a pastor, his name is Mark Buchanan, he puts it this way. He says, we are being the crowd when the experience of those inside the house is prioritized over the needs of those outside the house. We are being the crowd when the experience of those inside the house is prioritized over the needs of those outside the house. So it's when as the church we care more about things. We keep keeping things intact than we are about restoring lives that have been shattered. It's what happens as a church when we get more upset about a mess being made than messy lives coming to Jesus. It's when we get more upset about stuff being broken than we are about broken lives being restored and being mended in Christ. It's when the church exists for itself, turns its back on those outside, and says, to hell with the rest of you. You see, crashing the ceiling, it means going to great lengths. It means going to whatever lengths to make sure those outside the house come inside the house. That we're going to do whatever it takes. I try to imagine what some of those in the house might have said when they seen this roof coming down. I mean, most would have loved to have been in there and just to see the people's reaction as all this plaster begins to fall from the ceiling and it's falling in the lady's hair, and they're just like, I just got this done yesterday for church, and it's all messed up. And all of a sudden there's this whole, and I think, I think some of them would have been annoyed and said, hey, you know what, this isn't a good time for this. Obviously this isn't a good time. I mean, like, we've got this service program, right? I mean, we've got our Sunday morning, our Sunday night, and our Wednesday night. I mean, you could come back at any of those other times that are not then. Why do you have to disturb the programming? I think some of them could have said, hey, what's the deal? Why are they cutting in line? We were here first, right? As being first anywhere gives you a greater importance in Jesus' eyes. You see, when they start digging through the roof and the dust and the dirt starts coming in, I wonder if some in the crowd said, you know what, they're making a mess of this place. I mean, how can we have church in here? They're just making a mess of this, and you know what? I'm not going to help clean that up. I didn't make that mess. I'll just go to a different house. I mean, if this is the way they're going to do things around here, I'll just go to a different house. Or some might have said, hey, that's pretty expensive, right? Or I'm sure there was at least one person in the crowd said, well, nobody's ever done it that way before. And so as a church, we want to be bold, we want to be courageous, and if we're going to crash the ceiling, we're going to have to do some things in some unconventional ways. Because if y'all haven't seen or learned by now, just a church, having a church service, people are not going to come to you. If we were just to stay here and say, you know what, they know where we're at. They know where we're at. If they want Jesus, they can come. I saw this gift card. I saw this this pastor's wife on Facebook, and she was reaching out to this person, and she said, well, you know where we're at. Our doors are always open. I doubt she ever darkens those doors. You see, crashing the ceiling means that we're going to be bold and we're going to be courageous, and we might take some ridicule, we might take some flack. But if we go and the doors are closed and the windows are shut and we can't find a way in, we'll just go up to the roof. We'll just go up to the roof. Maybe some people in the house, maybe that day they went home, they were all so annoyed by what happened. And they got on Facebook, you won't believe what happened when I went to church today. But then there were some other people who went home and said, you know what? I can't believe what I got to experience today. The master was teaching, and he lowered this man down in his mat, and right there, Jesus healed him. Right there, I seen somebody get forgiven. Right there, I saw somebody be made whole. Because as we'll look at the rest of the story tonight, you see that there were two groups that left that day. There were people who left glorifying and praising God for what they'd seen and what they got to experience, but then there were people who were leaving who were just like, They criticized. And they said, well, you know what? That wasn't my cup of tea. That's not the way that I would have done it, even though they weren't doing anything at all. And so I want you to answer that question. Are you one of the friends, or are you someone in the crowd say that you are a friend, that you want to be a friend, then I really want you to think about how far you're willing to go to get somebody to Jesus. And I want us to think as a church, collectively. Because I'll tell you, some of the things that God has been leading me to introduce into our church of how we can reach people and how we can show the love of Christ, and I'll tell you, it's going to be risky. It might be costly. It might be unconventional. But this last year, we didn't have one person who was lost come into our church, get saved, and get baptized. Think about that. So that automatically assumes that what? That if we do the same things we did last year, we're going to get the same results, aren't we? And so what are we going to do? We're going to crash the ceiling. We're going to crash the ceiling. And so I need to know, as your pastor, how far are we willing to go? And we're going to talk about this. I'm actually going to open up a discussion tonight. How far are we willing to go? Let me ask you this. And these are hypothetical, but I want you to think about it. What if you had to come in and sit on the floor so that somebody else could have your seat? Would you be willing to do that Sunday after Sunday after Sunday? Because Sister Mona sent me this picture of this church. It was in Pakistan. And none of them were sitting in chairs. They were all sitting on the floor, and that house was packed. Let me ask you this. Would you change your political affiliation to reach one person? If you're a Republican, would you become a Democrat to change one person's eternity? Let me ask you this. Would you change being an OU fan to become an OSU fan? Or would you change it being an OSU fan to become an OU fan? Would you change who you are to see one person come to Him? How much money would you give? How much money would you give to save one person? Think about that. You think about all the money that you spend on all things in your life. How much would you give? How much did you give for your home? How much did you give for that car? How much did you give for that TV? Would you give that same amount to see one person saved? Let me ask you this. What if you had to give up everything? What if you had to give up everything for one soul? Because when you look at these four friends, they were willing to do whatever it takes. Why? Because they knew what Jesus could do, didn't they? I mean, that's the only reason why they go and up to the roof, and they tear a hole in the roof, and they disturb everything that's going on. Why? Because they knew what Jesus could do if they could just get their friend. And so, I ask you, what would you be willing to give up? But do you really believe that if you could just get your friend to Jesus, that everything could be changed for him? Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer.